Good boy. Look. That's you, man. Are you excited? Are you excited? You can go. Good boy. Good boy. Yes, good boy.
Miigwech Percy. Do you want to give props to who that was? Do we know?
That was Anishinaabe, Two Spirit. No, sorry. That was from Odamenkwe Singers. And that was the Haudenosaunee Unity song. I can't see it on my iPhone who the original person was, other than the fact that it was from Odamenkwe Singers.
Okay, Miigwech. Brian, are we recording now? I don't think I heard it. There. Great, Miigwech. We typically start with a smudge to encourage more people to come, and I've done that. And Percy typically starts us off with some music. So miigwech for that as well. I'm going to just briefly introduce myself and then go to some housekeeping issues. Bonjour, bozo, anin, tanzi, hello, minadunebe kwe indishnakaz, wawashkiji and dodum, sudbury and dijiba, Anishinaabe, Métis, Kwe and Dao, Nindawe, Maga, Nindog, Ninjunjiba, Swan Lake, Temiskaming and Timmins. Welcome all. I'd like to first introduce myself before I get into some logistics. I'm Lynn LaValle, Anishinaabe Métis, registered with the Métis Nation of Ontario. I'll introduce where my people, who my people are and where they're from, particularly because of the cultural fraud we see in the opportunities that are provided to Indigenous people. I've been doing this intro since about 2015. So it's not because of more recent events with Indigenous identity, but it's just something that I do as an Anishinaabe Métis. My mom, the last names on my mom's side are LaBelle, Lafont, Godin, McIver, LaRock, Swain, Lilly, Korchesny, David, Guibosh, Carpenter, Chartrand, Roy, and Carrier, to name a few. From the Swan Lake region in Manitoba, Mariopolis, Manitoba, Maniwaki and Gracefield in Quebec, and Timmins in Ontario. My dad and many generations are from the Temiskaming region on both sides of the river, with the last names LaValle, Gauthier, Pepin, Richard, Taylor, McKay, Champagne, Marion, and Bolido. I was born in Sudbury, Ontario, and grew up in Toronto's Regent Park. And currently, I'm on the traditional territory of the Chippewas of Georgina Island. I want to welcome you all. I'm hosting this webinar, but it in no way belongs to me. It's just the resources that we're taking at my university, which will remain nameless for now until the name changes. So just getting through some logistics here. We are broadcasting this YouTube live, and we will share the link with you in chat, and that YouTube live video will be available to you afterwards. We have the chat function turned off for the attendees, but we have the Q&A section turned on, so feel free to type any questions at any point. You won't interrupt us. We'll be watching the questions. And as we noted at the beginning, this is audio recorded. So I'm Chimigwech, and I'll take it over to Taima to introduce how this group came together. Oh, you have to put your mic on.
Thank you, Miigwech, Professor Lynn Lavilli, Katie and Brian for hosting and organising our webinars. Kia ora, ani, warm greetings. Bulavanaka. Welcome to those joining our webinar for the first time, and welcome back to those who joined our first two webinars. And thank you to our Twitter followers and those live tweeting our webinars. My name is Taima Moike Pickering. I use the pronoun she, her. I am a full professor in the School of Indigenous Relations at Laurentian University, Sudbury, Ontario. I am from the Ngāti Pūkeko and Tūhoe tribes. I've recently moved to Vaughan, Toronto, and my home is on the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee. Over the last 6 months, our group from Australia, Aotearoa, and across provinces in Canada have met to discuss ways to improve academia for Indigenous peoples. This is what drives us and why mentorship and sharing academic strategies is vital and meaningful for us. In our group are our colleagues who identify as transgender and non-binary. Our team is very close, so it is apt that our third webinar celebrates and raises awareness on this 12th annual International Transgender Day of Visibility, #TDOV. And Andy, our special guest, a very warm welcome. We encourage everyone to raise awareness, have discussions, create direct action, and spread knowledge about the trans community, no matter where you are. Thank you for joining us in our third webinar. I will now turn this next part over to our amazing moderator, Professor Sandy O'Sullivan. Happy birthday for yesterday in Australia and today here in Canada, dear friend.
Well, thank you. It's exciting to be here, and thank you so much for all of the beginning and framing parts of what we do here and what we've been doing here for a little while now. Today, obviously, it's the Trans Day of Visibility. It's also my 55th birthday, and I get to extend it. So it's amazing to turn 55. It is. I can honestly say this time last year, I didn't think it was going to happen. I'm here on Kabi Kabi land, so it's not my ancestral homelands, which is Wiradjuri, the site of Wiradjuri people. Being Wiradjuri, I'm very fortunate that I have a pronoun that's not in either of the binary genders. There actually isn't one available in the binary genders. So it's Gwyn, and in English, they, them. So I'm transgender. I identify as non-binary within the trans space. And I'm going to start by introducing myself, but what we're going to do is we're going to answer some questions about what the day means to us. And we're going to start with the people who are in the room who identify as trans, so who are identified in this space as trans, I mean, they are trans. And I'm then going to open it up to talk about this issue broadly of inclusion in the academy, because we've had a problem that we've been solving here of what it means to participate in the academy, you know, and so it's really important that we start to worry that in the sight of something that's really important, which is a space of understanding our place and our rightful place here. So, and I'm very fortunate in that I've got colleagues who are here, who are actually part of my department, and in fact, I'm a newcomer to that space, so I really want to reflect and honour that as well. So yes, I'm Wiradjuri. I'm somebody who has always worked across universities, but I've also been a musician and been a performer. So I spent the last 30 years working in the academy. So it's coming up to 30 years in August, so I have to say 29 years. And I love that every year my birthday falls on the Transgender Day of Visibility. This issue of visibility is really important, but it's also really important that we recognise that there are a lot of people who can't be visible, but it doesn't mean that we don't see them. And it doesn't mean that they don't have a really important role to play. And of course, as the years go on, we want them to feel as though they can be visible. And this is, you know, particularly important for us as First Nations peoples to be able to understand the place, our place, and to understand the connections that we have. So, I have been working on this project. I talked about it a little bit last week, but I wouldn't mind just taking a moment through these introductions and through this explanation of the central work that we do to challenge this, to say this project, it's called Saving Lives, Mapping the Influence of LGBTIQ plus First Nations creative artists. It's a new project. It's a project that's made up of a lot of little projects. It's happening at Macquarie. I work as a professor in the Department of Indigenous Studies at Macquarie University, and it's in Sydney, on beautiful Darrignura. I'm really fortunate to be in that space, but as a Wiradjuri scholar, I have worked in this space of queer studies and gender studies and creative practice for a really long time. But like a lot of us, the focus has been on survival. And sometimes when the focus is on survival, the colonizer gets very interested in the idea of how to save us from dying, but they're not so interested in how to help us live well. And this idea of Yindamara is an important idea in Wiradjuri. Yindamara Wananganu in particular, this notion of living well and making a world in which other people can live well as well is an essential part of who we are as a people. And so this project is about doing that. It's doing a whole lot of things from an academic perspective, but it's mostly doing things from a community perspective. It's saying if you can see yourself represented, if you can see yourself in the world, then actually what happens is you can see a way to be who you are, to authentically be who you are. Your family can see a way for you to move through the world with a level of comfort that cisgender people feel. And so on this Trans Day of visibility, and I love that it's not Day of Trans Visibility. You know, it really is saying this is our day, and it's our day to be visible in all the ways that we can be. That it recognises that we've been making and marking space for millennia. You know, this is nothing new. This is something that is both traditional and contemporary, and it is. And we are people who have always been here. And so I think it's really essential that we have that as, you know, as a marked message. I'm now going to throw it over to, I've got a kind of a running order for how this is going to work, but I want to just be really clear about the fact that we've also got a whole lot of our colleagues who are here to talk about this issue of inclusion. And I think it'll be really interesting to hear about what they have to say about diversity as well. But I really want to frame this by saying I never could have imagined that I would have this opportunity to be around this kind of national and international space where actually First Nations trans voices are privileged. And I'm really, really grateful to that. And I'm grateful for the connection beyond to Maddie and Andy, who are my colleagues, to Percy. And so I'm actually going to throw it to Percy and just say thank you so much for just being an amazing colleague and just a really good friend.
Okay, here comes the Chichen medicine, the firekeeper medicine into the room. And because there's our medicine here, we've impacted our colleague. The trickster medicine is here. How you doing there, relative? My sound is very low. Okay, so I gotta put my headphones on. I went on a
ASL is my first language, folks. And I welcome folks here to this presentation for our transgender diverse, or in my language, Nimtilks, which I really pushed our language speakers to really peel back the layers of colonization. I get that as I continue to be a guest on the homelands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and the Three Fire Confederacy, that my people have 250 years less of colonization, but we have colonization all the same. And so I've pushed my language speakers, because if we want to talk about, since we've already taken up decolonization, if we want to resurge and pick up and remind and wake our blood up of the Indigenous excellence that's there, we have to go back to our lands and to our languages. And so our languages are not just binary. So the language speakers have been really working hard about remembering who we were and are and continue to be. And so I'm very grateful to share in my language, not this English mutt language that we're speaking, who I am and how I am, one of the ways I'm in the world. Minim chilks, they, them, theirs. I want to welcome you folks. My mother's people, my life givers territory is west of here, 4 days and 4 nights drive. And colonially and under the Indian Act, unceded Penticton, Sinpinkton in our language, which means village between lakes. My grandparents said that our lake and water systems are like the veins in our arms. Some you can see, some you don't, and all have a vital importance. And in my greeting, I want to give thanks to the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Cree, and the folks of the Three Fire Confederacy, and as per the Indian Act, the Mississaugas of the New Credit, for continuing to allow me to be a guest on your homelands. I want to take this opportunity and pay my respects locally. For the Caribbean and Black queer community that are grieving one of their own, Michelle Ross. I want to raise my hands up to you, and before I smudged, I ask Creator to lighten your hearts as you continue to grieve community members and relatives and kin. I also wanted to pay respects to my relatives back home who have the council fires lit for two of our own who have gone on to the happy hunting grounds. And I only hope that the young folks get the support they need with these latest losses. It just seems like my family doesn't get a break. It's been ongoing loss after ongoing loss. One of them was my sibling. Right, we were raised together in child welfare. And so I hope the young folks get the support they need right now. So, which brings me to this topic. I just wanted to pay those respects that not only do I come here with joy and jubilation that I actually get to be in conversation and be supported and seen by scholars, by intellects, by a council fire, but that I also carry these things with me as well. So I brought the thunder in. So when I talk about what it means to be Minimchiks, I get that there's a way that my language speakers have shared in this mutt language called English, and what that can be, but it's much more than that. I joked earlier about my relative, because there's many of us in this room and our medicine is strong, that it affected somebody's electricity. That's the extent of what we have the capacity to do. And folks on here who are all about science, and like, it's gonna really mess with your mind. I've been told from a young age by those who have the capacity to bridge the past with the current and the future, and have the capacity to take from this to heal and support people's wellness in terms of botany and go into the land for our medicines. That Minimchilks Stamia, which is in my language, the name for two spirit, are the circle, are the medicine bundles, are what is going to bring us forward into the future of this hot mess that we currently have had to endure. It's been a theme these last couple of weeks, not only with these webinars, but the things that I've been lecturing. My appointment is at Wilfrid Laurier University in the Indigenous Studies Department. My profession, as discovered last week, social work, expelled me because I made it quite clear that I'm abolitionist. These systems are built to do exactly what they're meant to do. And you gave me kicks, but you tied them up and you made me teach. But every time you told me to go teach, I would stand up and fall on my face. So I had to change my environment. I had to change an environment that actually wanted to actualize Indigenous excellence, two-spirit excellence, non-binary excellence, and disabled excellence. That's connected and really beyond tokenism, really wanted to see relationality with connections to community. So that's where I'm at for now. So if we think about institutions, I have to pose to you, what are the ways in which you are creating brave spaces for trans, non-binary, gender diverse folks? Do people when you do your media campaigns, do they reflect the different ways Indigenous, gender diverse, queer, disabled folks look like? Do they see themselves represented in positions that are not just one-off, they teach one course that perpetuates the precarity, violent cycle? Most departments rely on precarious folks teaching one or two courses to carry the whole faculty on its back. And some of those faculties are present in this Zoom. So if you want to talk about if you are inclusive, what are the ways in which you're doing outreach to communities to say that please come here? You're going to see people who look like you based on our literature, based on our websites, based on our forums. Are you giving opportunities for potential learners to say, hey, not only can I use my legal name until I have the resources to change from what people keep referring to in terms of my dead name to my name, and I can't sign this treaty, right? I'm going, right? And just say I'm male or female. My treaty is Minimchilks. And how is your forms for entry into your departments, creating those opportunities for gender diverse folks? So which brings me to the other side of the table. When you strike up and you have conversations with HR, what are the ways in which you're letting folks like me, Sandy, if they were looking for a job, Andy, if they were looking for a job, or Maddie, if they were looking for a job, that your department and program is safe for us? What is the wording on the advertisements? When your administrative support contacts me to say, oh, you're one of the 3 candidates to come and do a job talk and be for 2 days, for 12 hours a day to see if you can fit with us. How are you communicating to me the nearest single stall washroom? So I don't have to hold off from when I leave my hotel room to when I go back 12 hours and 5 minutes later, because you're not letting me know where I can safely use a single stall washroom, because every floor has a man's washroom and a woman's washroom, right? What are the ways are you letting me know that I can have access to an interpreter, right? Because I just shared with you my language, ASL, the first language that I learned and spoke, right? In terms of accessibility. And this actually shouldn't be the bar, folks. And what are the ways in which you actually ask questions about the work that I'm doing that may not fit your timelines of me to actually engage in community? Because it's already been identified by colleagues last week and the week before that Indigenous people have been researched to death. They have an absolute right to mistrust me, regardless of me having shared membership identity, but I represent a system of harm and ongoing violence, right? That how are you gonna support me as a gender diverse scholar and actualizing a reciprocal relationship, again, going back to relationality, and support the way people want me to share information with you, right? So those are a lot of the things that I sit with and that I constantly reflect on. And much like last week, I wonder, do I have the energy, right? Do I have the capacity? When I go to this meeting, is my colleague gonna say to Lynn, you've just misgendered Percy and pick that labor up? Is Lynn then gonna turn to Moana and say, when we're in conversation, I really encourage you to have a conversation with Percy directly. I get that I'm a safer person because I'm cisgendered, but we have to stop labeling Percy as a monster because of their Indigenous, two-spirit, non-binary identities, right? That's cis, I call it cis flight and fright. When folks label and name me as the problem. And much like Bronwyn brought to us in our circle on our council fire last week, the feminist killjoys. Right? Yeah, so I think about all those things, and I think about how is it someone like me who has gotten $2 million in research and gone to 15 peer-reviewed conferences, was a keynote at some key conferences internationally, does not have an appointment at an institution, that is not preparing for a full professorship? Well, I'll tell you, it's because I'm critical. It's because I'm not the type of trans scholar that they want. I push back against cis normativity. I push back on and want folks to do more than just for today. Send me an email, I put across social media. Let's see our transgender diverse people. No, I want to know, much like a guest lecturer shared with me this past week, and I want to acknowledge Chris Saget Richards for their labor as a Black gender diverse guest lecturer. Cis folks, what are you doing when nobody's looking? How do you talk about me and the transgender diverse folks when we're not in the room? How are you promoting the work that we do when we're not in that Zoom meeting? How are you advocating for us when it's our annual reviews with the deans? Right? And what are you doing to actually support our successful promotion from a limited term appointment to assistant, to associate, to full professor? Because if we see the statistics nationally here in Canada, it's already identified that we have very few people who are in tenured positions, and even less who are at full professor. One of them is in that room, two of them, two and a half, because there's someone off camera, right? But how many look like me and sound like me? And if institutions truly want excellence, well, that excellence needs an intersectional lens and the way in which it evaluates me and my work, and not on your timelines. Because the stuff that community trusts me to do is a lot more sustainable than what's being peddled right now, right? Because a lot of the stuff that I do, probably it does not end up institutions, because it would end up on a shelf. But the people in the community trust what I'm doing because I've built a relationship with them. And I've shown them this is what my capacities are. And these are the ways in which I'm going to go to battle against administrators and funders when they say I have to do X, Y, Z. Right? So never did I ever think that I was going to be in a webinar, being able to talk about the real lived experiences that I have had to survive, and think that I had the capacity to thrive and reimagine another future as possible by being invited to this space. And I want to be mindful of time because we have other relatives here. So I want to raise my hands up to Sandy, Andy, Maddie, and other folks for holding space for us to engage and be in conversation. With that, Lim Lam.
Thank you so much, Percy. You've raised a lot of really crucial points. Just before I send it over to Maddie, who's participated in all of these, and then on to Andy, who is joining us as a guest in this space. I really want to reflect on what you just said about this idea of the role and the work that our CIS colleagues need to really engage in. I can tell you right now that we wouldn't have 2 full professors at Macquarie if it wasn't for Bronwyn Carlson, absolutely, who's here in the session if people can't see her, didn't absolutely understand the importance of having that voice and using that voice and using it regardless of her level of comfort. And I'm not suggesting, Bronwyn, that you didn't find it comfortable to do it, but it's no mean feat to kind of step out of your space and to advocate, you know, in a way that is actually around trying to get people who would otherwise not understand the importance of having trans visibility to genuinely understand it. Because what we face all the time, and this won't be a surprise to most people in the room and most people who are watching, is this idea that we can only be one level of diversity. We can only be First Nations or queer trans. You know, we can't be both. That there are these circles that don't intersect. Of course they do. Of course they do. And we're not the canary in the coal mine of how people treat any level of diversity. We're not, because that's not fair. But that's often how we're treated in that space. And what was amazing about coming to the Department of Indigenous Studies, without sounding like I'm just, you know, a new employee and really excited about this, but it was recognizing that we were front and center in that space as well, and that we were not doing it in some kind of a levels, but actually there as a part of an ongoing relationship. So to that end, I'm actually going to pass on to my colleague, Maddie.
Thank you, Professor O'Sullivan. And thank you, Percy. You know, I always hate to go after Percy because you're just like too good, my sib. Put the rest of us to shame. So thank you so much for having me again. What an honor once again to join this group. My name's Maddie. So I'm coming to you today as a guest on Gadigal and Wongal land. I'm Gugu Yalanji, and I also work in the Department of Indigenous Studies at Macquarie University. Of course, I can really connect to everything that Sandy and Percy just discussed. Even after last week, and last week we spent some time speaking about ourselves, and I thought, oh, I had to say so many different, had to list so many different labels or list so many different aspects of my identity, which actually usually makes me feel uncomfortable, right? Because when you're too many things that are too different, you just feel like, oh, maybe I'm trying to be too different or something like that. Maybe it comes across that way. And I suppose that is my experience, generally speaking, of the world, growing up as a person who was both intersex and queer, and eventually working out that I was transgender as well. So intersex people are people who have biological variations, so biological sex variations, and not all intersex people are transgender. However, I do identify as transgender because I don't assign to the gender that I don't subscribe to the gender that was assigned to me at birth. So that's my own experience. So I would say that this experience has often positioned me as Percy was talking about, very disruptive as a person, because you kind of get this. You kind of inhabit this square peg space, right? So you become known to others and yourself as both disruptive and inconvenient, because most spaces aren't designed for you, so you always stick out within them. And of course, universities and institutions are no exception. However, as I sort of as I began to be sort of pushed out of one community, I was pushed into another one as a young person, and I really found myself among queer and trans mob. And for me now, being trans is one of the most greatest sources of pride in my life. It brings me, I have so many joyful relationships from being trans, and I'm so grateful. It's something that I love so much about myself and the people around me, including my siblings, both biological and otherwise. So I think that one thing I'd just like to say to kind of wrap up is that, rather than, because we're both disruptive and inconvenient, we can also be some of the most innovative and visionary people as well. So for me, I have always said that if you would like to see, if you're unhappy with the the dynamic that we live in currently under, in our case, settler colonialism, or your own context elsewhere, if you are unhappy with that dynamic, if you are dedicated to change, and if you can envision futures where we have healed relationships, then why not centre queer and transgender voices? Why not put us at the center of that work? Because we are actually the experts of navigating, like re-envisioning and reinventing relationships, and critiquing and surviving these structures. We have actually, now an intergenerational legacy of it that is becoming stronger and stronger. Yeah. So what I would say is I think we are experts in this space, and I think that people have a responsibility now to lift us up and take advantage of that knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, this challenge to the colonial project of gender is something that we can obviously very specifically contribute to, but the colonial project of gender affects everyone, and look to us to see how we're challenging that, and it'll help anyone who is challenging the whole notion of where how their gender is being placed for them. not with them and not by them, but but for them. And this is something that everybody needs to challenge. The work that we do in this space is about future casting in that way, but it's also about recognizing that deep history of connection. And I loved what you said about that idea of the multiplicity of our identities being seen as both this burden, and then you turning it into this opportunity to kind of grow the idea of who you are as well. So yeah, thank you so much. Now I really want to welcome Andy, who's joined us for the first time as a group. Andy, can I throw to you to introduce yourself and to, I guess, answer this big question of, what are we doing here, and how do we do it, and why do we do it?
I'm still asking myself, what am I doing here? And every day the answer shifts in one way or another. It's like a bit of a Rubik's Cube. Hi, everybody. Such a pleasure to be here as a guest in this space, and follow on after such amazing voices across this space of Indigenous, trans, non-binary and queer excellence. So happy to be here today. My name is Andy Farrell. I use they, them pronouns, but I also tend to be quite flexible around pronouns, and accept such varying degrees of whatever gender, as long as you acknowledge me, my personhood. I respond quite well. So just a bit of context for me, my cultural background, I am Wadi identified, which means, well, for those of you geographically, that means I come from the nations that span the coastal regions of New South Wales below Sydney area. And Wadi is currently the lands that I'm on. I'm on my grandmother's lands, my matriarchal lands, and am so happy to broadcast my identities, as complex and shifting as they are, outwards each week, as I am involved in both the kind of academic landscape as well as teaching to students and negotiating and building their literacy around acknowledging Indigenous gender, sex and sexual diversities. So I do that through my current role within Macquarie University. I'm one of the Macquarie mob in the Indigenous Studies department, and this is through a long and ongoing vision that started with myself and Bronwyn Carlson. Bronwyn tied in once again into the schemes of creating and claiming space for gender, sex and sexual diverse Indigenous peoples. And for me right now in my trajectory, I sit as a early career academic fellow. So I am quite early in the game in terms of my standing in academia. But I think that so far it's been heavily impactful, and I'm so grateful for it. It's a wild opportunity for somebody like me to be in such a position that I never really ever saw myself being in, as a queer Indigenous person, as a part of a community entrenched in ongoing forms of violence and trauma and poverty, that I would never be in such a position to exist in the way that I do now. So I'm very grateful for that every step of the way. So I wanted to talk a little bit into the way that my identity has kind of shifted over time in relation to, coming into the academic space. And I think it is through academic spaces where particularly Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have already kind of done significant labour in claiming spaces decades before I stepped foot in the door as a late 20s to now 32-year-old person. So that's the kind of spaces, the Indigenous spaces, especially meeting Bronwyn Carlson, it kind of ignited this trajectory towards ways in which we could generate forms of inclusion in academia that was guided and self-determined by ourselves, first and foremost, and also challenging these systems that exist around us. So that's such a kind of a heavy and layered kind of story, and it all coincides with the development of my own identity as a trans person who primarily identifies as queer and non-binary. For me, I have taken it has taken a lot of time for me to claim these terms queer and non-binary, and to be able to articulate it occurred during my kind of undergraduate honours and now PhD positions. I didn't really have that kind of language, but now I do, because I survived these privileged spaces. I like to, it was very challenging coming up through undergraduate, in an undergraduate degree, in finding myself both from a position of being a cultural other in that space, as well as being a gendered and sexual other in that space as well. So coming to the point of now having a Queer Indigenous Studies unit, which is literally one of my bucket list goals, has been made available to me by the work of my community, which is strongly Indigenous, strongly trans, strongly queer. And I'm privileged to, continue that path. And in terms of the kind of broader kind of academic landscape and inclusion, I feel like I exist in a little bit of a privileged bubble, my own kind of privileged bubble. I'm not talking about privilege in the sense that, in the broader sense that we know privilege, but my own sense of privilege is being able to breathe and exhale and exist in a space that is saves a seat for me at the table. So thank you all for just listening to my little bit of a rant. I hope that you got something out of it, and happy to keep on with these conversations. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Andy. That was amazing. That feeling of breathing, that idea of exhaling. It's so much. I was reflecting on it yesterday, or we can carry this on into today, my birthday, because I think I've been very public about the fact that I tried to kill myself last year, and I had a very hard year. Lots of people did. I've never had those feelings before, but a lot of it was to do with my gender, and a lot of and how other people felt about that, but also how I did, which is sometimes about how other people feel about that too. And look, this is really incredibly a difficult thing to talk about, but we do it, and we persevere with that because we must actually. But that idea of feeling as though you can exhale and not hold the breath in is what I felt being a part of this group, and what I felt being a part of a group that's worrying a problem that we all know exists, which is how do we find a place, all of us find a place in the academy, and how do we support ideas of the diverse presentations that we all have. You know, we're all our own unique people, not somehow representative of every First Nations community or even our First Nations community as a whole, where, you know, we're there and a part of this very difficult and problematic colonial space, highly colonial space and highly colonized space of the academy. And how do we disrupt that? And as you say, we do it by actually having cohorts, actually having ways to come together, and we do it by rejecting those ideas that that force us out when we can, you know, when we can, because that hasn't been the case across my career, and I don't want that to be the case for other people as they come through. So I've loved our, you know, we've been celebrating obviously the Trans Day of Visibility or Transgender Day of Visibility. And I wonder if I can throw to the broader group now to look at ways to ensure inclusion across, you know, the idea of including trans people, but also other diversities within our communities. You know, again, this notion of including diversity, you know, we don't, I could just speak for myself. I don't want to just be included because I'm, you know, I'm trans. I want to be included because I'm all of the things that I am. You know, it is about the recognizing that we are all quite different. And so how do we do that in these academic spaces? And I'm actually going to throw to Carrie, if you don't mind. I know that you're having to cut your time with us short today, and I really appreciate you agreeing to go first in this next stage of it to think about this idea of diversity. Carrie.
Well, thanks, everyone. Sorry, I have to leave right away for another event, but I've been thinking about this, and you know, everybody is so incredible. I think, unfortunately, sometimes it's not only about you know, the academy. Sometimes it's about our own communities. There's been a lot of lateral violence happening. At least in the spaces that I've been in lately. And I appreciate the fact that, of course, there are a lot of reasons why we have to be cautious, you know, in terms of you know, people who are being false in our communities, and we have to be very cautious about that. But I think sometimes the pendulum can go a little bit too far, and I know that there's a lot of hurting people in our own communities, and that hurt often can turn into lateral violence, and that can cause a lot of exclusion. And I see that happening more and more, particularly in the academy, where we want to lean on our own community members, and it becomes very hurtful when our own people that we trust, whether they're Indigenous or not, whether they're two-spirited or queer or whatever, you know, if there are people you don't expect for them to turn on you. And it's not just a little squabble. These are very deep-seated issues. And, you know, you're already trying to deal with, you know, many intergenerational issues and harmful issues, and the academy itself, which we know is not very safe spaces. So, you know, I just feel like it seems to be getting harder, and it's already hard. So it's gotten to the point where I've actually really been bringing elders in on a regular basis into our lab space, for example, because I'm seeing it, pour over into our trainees and those that are coming up, and it's alarming. It's really alarming. So I just I don't really, I mean, for the most part, I take the high road, but it does bother me that I'm seeing it more and more, not only in the academy, but also in our communities. And I just, I just wonder in some of the ways we're making a lot of strides, and we're creating space and doing some great things. And then on the other hand, you're sort of taking 10 steps back. So I don't really have anything profound in terms of how to address it, but I it's just some observations that I'm really witnessing, and I'm not the only one. Elders are seeing it as well. Elders are experiencing that, and when you see elders experiencing that, it's you've got to stop and take some pause and wonder, how are we going to, bring everybody together and really seriously be inclusive, and try to really address this. But I think it really is problematic, and I think it's going to take some real healing to address, for everybody. So I don't really, I don't know if that was really helpful or not helpful, but that's really what I'm witnessing.
It really was. I think it just reflects, I guess, one of the areas that we all vaguely touched on, but it is this real concern, and we've talked about it before in this group, but this real concern about understanding who we all are and what contributions we make, but also recognizing the tension between the reality of our communities, and then this other thing that's happening around management of people, around control and how that control is enacted. I just before you go, Carrie, I actually realized that I forgot to ask you to introduce yourself as well. So I just wonder if you can, for the audience, so people know who you are and where you're from. So sorry about that. I know that you did to us earlier, but you haven't for the group, and I'll then hand it around to others. Thank you.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, I'm Carrie Barassa. I'm originally from Treaty 4 territory. My grandfather raised me. I'm from Regina. I'm Anishinaabe Métis, and I have a daughter who's 22 and a younger daughter who's 11. They're born on the exact same day, January 2nd, so it's pretty special. And they both almost look identical, even though they're 11 years apart, and they have the same voice. It's pretty incredible. I'm pretty proud of them. And both of them were hockey players. My daughter went and played in the States for a while, and she just finished playing a little while ago. So we're hockey parents. My husband and I have been married for almost 30 years. We're high school sweethearts. And I live now in Saskatoon. I'm the scientific director of the Institute of Indigenous Peoples Health at CIHR. And I have 2 labs. I have a cultural safety lab that's being built at the University of Saskatchewan. And I have a lab in Regina. It's called Morningstar Lodge. And it's a mentorship lab. And I have, I think now 17 staff at Morningstar Lodge. So it keeps me busy. And I also have an appointment with the Immunity Task Force. That keeps me pretty well busy. But I've been working at home. I don't travel or anything, and I'm very much looking forward to my first vaccination shot. So that's coming up. I think everybody's starting to get their shots now, and I think it's starting to resonate with communities as well. Leadership is starting to go into communities to sort of get people motivated to be vaccinated. And it's frankly, I think that it's coming along way better than we thought that it would. So if you haven't been vaccinated, I hope you do get vaccinated. That's where I'll end today. So thanks so much for having me. I wish I could stay longer, but I'm sure that we'll connect again.
Oh, I'm so glad that I asked you for the introduction, because that was amazing. Thank you so much, Gary. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much. So I'm going to sign off unless you need anything else.
No worries. Thanks. We'll see you again. So if I can now shift to just double checking that you're still on here, Sariana. Of course you are. So if I can switch to Sariana, would I be able to ask you this question of, obviously we've been celebrating Trans Day of Visibility, but I wonder if I can ask you about this idea of how we ensure inclusion. Ensure sounds like I'm putting a lot of responsibility on you for this, right? But what work do we do to think about this idea of inclusion in the academy, and maybe it's about our communities as well? So thanks, Ariana.
I'm sure I can solve that in 30 seconds, Sandy. Thank you.
No worries.
Nisan Bulavanaka, my name is Riana Naepi. I am named after my great-grandmother who raised my mother in the village of Nankinda in Naita City in Fiji. I carry my husband's last name, whose family are from Avasali and Tamakatonga. I have 2 girls, and we've continued the pattern of carrying names with you. My first daughter carries all of the matriarchy on her shoulders, so I'm sure that's going to end really well for us as she grows and inherits all of the wonderful traits on both sides of the family. And then our youngest daughter carries the names of the patriarchy, actually. So not patriarchy, the paternal side. So her name is after her great-grandfather. Her middle name is my father's name. And then a wonderful mentor has slipped in there as well. So I think for me, names tell you a lot about people, and that's why I take the time to sort of work through that. And I want to acknowledge as well my colleagues and my family in this space who have really opened it in such a beautiful way, and also kind of called us to account in really powerful ways over how we use our positionality to create and make and hold spaces. And Bronwyn, I honestly thank you so much for role modeling all of us what we can do for others in our community for inclusion. And I think that that's kind of what it's about, right? Is that when we get a little bit of privilege or a little bit of power in these spaces, we move in ways that enable others to come with us. And we really have to think about how we do that and a little bit strategic. I was really lucky last night. I went to like the fanciest dinner I've ever been to in my life. But I got to sit next to Cindy Kiro, and she talked to me about how to make space and how to think about moving forward the different ways and the different positions and institutions that we should aim for to make those spaces. So in some ways, I think one of the things that I've spoken about with others is that there's sort of that individual responsibility for inclusion, then there's the institutional responsibility for inclusion, and then there's the sector. So the work that we do calls to account the sector. We count those numbers because you can't hide. You cannot hide when we know the numbers. And what happens when we don't even collect the data? So I couldn't tell you how many Indigenous trans families we have in the academy because we don't even collect the data at this point. So how do you worry about inclusion when you can't even, you have to personally know, or you have to, like, if we don't have that data, we can't hold the sector to account. Because when we start to talk about, in my experience, I can count 2 on my hands, the sector goes, that's not real data though. So we have to push our sector to collect that information so that we can push them and hold them to account. But at the same time, we have to get our institutions on board, because they will push like crazy and they will really fight that accountability. And that accountability really matters. And one of the other, I'm lucky. I always tell people I'm of the generation of Indigenous academics who were raised in an Indigenous academy. So you get to have these amazing conversations like the ones we're having now on quite a regular basis. And I've had another mentor kind of talk to me about the politics of distraction, and our universities are really good at distracting us. And I really appreciate the time that we have together, because it's that reminder not to get distracted, right? The time that we spend together and we talk to each other about our different experiences and our different ideas reminds us not to get distracted by that, and to hold our institutions to account. And the power in, and we saw it with the Waikato 6, the power in networking, right? We had an institution like, we're not racist, we're not racist, we're not racist. Oh, 6,500 Indigenous academics think we're racist. Oh no, we might be. And I think that that's the power behind, if one of us needs to hold our institutions to account, we're able to call on this wider network to say, my institution's not behaving well. How do we highlight this? And then at an individual level, I think we have to care for ourselves and for each other. We can't do everything. Joanna Kidman's really good about reminding myself and colleagues that we're not going to solve racism overnight, and we're not going to solve exclusion overnight, but we can chip away at it slowly, and we need to care for each other in different ways. Tara and I like to send each other chocolate cookies. It's our little, like, oh, I can tell you're having a rough day, here's some cookies. But I think just checking in on each other, because that's our individual responsibility. It's not our individual responsibility to do all of the work of what our institutions and sector should be doing. It's our individual responsibility to check in with Percy and say, Percy, how are you? What can I do? How can I help? Sandy, how's life? Right? That's our responsibility as individuals, is how do we check in with each other, make sure each other's well. And then if we happen to be an individual who has a minute amount of power in these institutions, do what Bronwyn's done and make space, hold space, and make it impossible for the institutions to ignore us. I think that's, yeah, thank you for letting me rant for a little bit.
We loved that rant. That was amazing. Thank you so much. Soriana, that was probably this kind of encapsulation of not just thanks to Bronwyn as somebody who's modeled that practice, but kind of also just the personal of, we have to check in with one another. You know, we have to do that work and keep that going. I'm now gonna to throw to Moana to answer this very broad question, though I'm sure very specifically. So, Moana, thank you.
Thanks, Sandy. Tēnā koutou katoa, ko moana te rotoku ingoa, he uri au mō ngā pui, nui tonu. Kia ora and warm greetings. My name's Moana Theodore. I'm a researcher in Aotearoa, New Zealand. My iwi tribe is Ngā Pui, and I live in the tribal region of Kaitahu, Katimaimoi, and Waitaha in the South Island. I use the pronoun ia in Te Reo Māori in the Māori language. It is used for she and he, so it's just simply ia in Te Reo, but in Te Reo Pākehā in the English language, she and her. So, and I'm a mother of 3, and it's a privilege and honour to be sitting here today on this special panel on International Transgender Day of Visibility. That was yesterday in Aotearoa, and I mentioned I'm a mother of 3, but my eldest daughter pulled me aside at dinner and made sure to tell me it was that day. And so that increasing level of recognition, and especially in our younger ones, is hope. And I'm actually about to talk about hope, but I just want to say happy birthday, Sandy, for yesterday, and a special thank you to Andy and Maddie and Sandy and Percy for starting us off. It's a real privilege and honour to be here, and I really was just keen to listen, but I do, Sandy's asked me to talk a little bit about inclusion, so I'll give it a go and try and be quite brief and maybe just touch upon some things that are happening here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So I think the term inclusion, and I think that was the question, is an interesting one. I think it's both, I've seen it used positively and negatively, diversity and inclusion. And Taima at our first seminar talked about hope. So I'll start with the positive. I think I've seen diversity and inclusion thinking and initiatives being used positively in Aotearoa, New Zealand, as a way of pushing this, the embracing and the recognition of a broader sense of research excellence and Indigenous research excellence. And we saw that recently, and I'll give the example of, was it last month that we had 12 new Māori fellows announced as part of the Royal Society New Zealand Te Apārangi. And so, and Percy talked earlier about these, a broader sense of what excellence looks like in the academy, and also, in terms of what that means in terms of the impact on community. So much broader than, these H indexes and journal citations and what we normally see in academia, but how do we, as Indigenous peoples, understand excellence when it comes to knowledge? And also just honouring the work that our Indigenous scholars do, and I know our Māori scholars do here in Aotearoa at the interface of, Indigenous knowledges, mātauranga Māori, and also Western dominated sciences. So the pushing forward of that theory and that practice. So that's the hope, and that's the way I've seen inclusion and diversity when it gets discussed here, used in a positive sense. But I was left with thinking about this in terms of negative as well. Sometimes it's used, and I'll try and explain what I mean by that. When I've heard inclusion and diversity used narrowly, and when it's without an understanding, or it doesn't address issues of equity and inequities, and when it doesn't take into account intersectionality, and Maddie and Sandy talked about this, the multiplicity of identities, and when it doesn't acknowledge gender diversities and the rights of Indigenous peoples as well, and treaty rights, when it's used so narrowly, whether intentionally or unintentionally, what I've seen happen, and I'm sure others, is it ends up privileging a group. It can end up privileging a group and maintaining power dynamics. And I'll use an example in a moment. And I suppose, and I was moved by, Maddie's discussion of, it moves us away from this healing of relationships, and it takes us out of those spaces that Andy talks about, of the creation of spaces to breathe. And so I wasn't here last week, so it sounds like there was a bit of a discussion about feminism, and I personally have to admit I owe a lot to feminist thinking and feminism. As a student of the 90s, it informed my thinking around critical theory. But when I was thinking about today, I've heard, certain individuals and groups, for example, use feminism in a way that, maintains power and privilege, that is trans exclusionary. And there's a quote that kept coming into my mind before this seminar from the wonderful Toni Morrison. And she says, if you can only be tall because someone else is on their knees, then you have a serious problem. I'll say that again, if you can only be tall because someone else is on their knees, you have a serious problem. She was referring to white people having a serious problem, but if we're using terms like diversity and inclusion, and it does that, then we have a serious problem. And I just wanted to leave that there. So thank you for letting me participate.
Oh, thank you so much. That was an amazing framing. I know we've only got a very limited amount of time, but I really want us to make sure that we hear from the last three participants here around this. Yes, inclusion is a really problematic word, and it's also right. So both of these, this tension is something that we need to have some say in the narrative, not control it, have a right to have a say in it. So if I can push it onto the brilliant Bronwyn Carlson, who's just been given a whole lot of kudos about this stuff. Thank you, Bronwyn, if you can add your voice to this idea, and by all means challenge the notion of inclusion as well. What an amazing Morrison quote. Anyway, yeah.
That is a fantastic quote. Thanks, Moana. And thank you. Happy birthday for yesterday, Prof. Look, I have been getting a bit of praise this morning, and my head has grown to a normal size, but I think I need to keep that a little bit in perspective, that I have had the opportunity to be the learner in these circumstances, not the other way around. So I'm using my title as professor as a way to carve spaces for people, but it is me that has learnt all along. So I remember when I first met Andy back in the old days down here in Wollongong, back in those days, Andy, I said to Andy, who was doing their work, and I didn't really understand anything about Indigenous queer space. I took up sociology and Indigenous studies. I have always been outraged by exclusion. That's something that's always bothered me in my life, and even to the point that I wrote the book on the politics of identity, because I was concerned with who counts and who doesn't count. I've always been annoyed by settler institutions that exclude Indigenous people, people of colour, people with disability, people who don't fit inside that norm. That's always just really been what maintains the rage for me. And so I meet Andy, this fabulous student, who tells me about Indigenous queer stuff. And it's something that I hadn't known about. I have 4 children of my own, and my youngest is non-binary. And that came a bit later after meeting Andy, those revelations to me, and made me question about what did it mean to be a parent of this beautiful person, and how can I be a great parent to this person who is getting excluded on all levels of their life. So Andy taught me so much. So I'm the learner, and I'm the one who gets to hang out with fabulous knowers who teach me. And then later, Andy said to me, you know, their dream was to teach Indigenous queer studies. And I'm like, well, what is that? Who do you want to learn? Like, who can help me learn this stuff? But who is it that you're reading? And Andy rolled off some names, and I said, right, well, okay. Andy's idea to have a symposium at Wollongong back then was to bring queer scholars to the campus, Indigenous queer scholars, to talk about being Indigenous and queer. And that was my, you know, first sort of introduction to these great thinkers, and it's inspired everything I've done ever since, because I think if we're talking about people who get excluded, then we're really talking about, you know, Indigenous people who are gender diverse, non-binary, trans, and queer. And this is all language that I learned from my learning from Andy at that point in time. And then I met the fabulous Maddie, who, you know, I need to give good praise to too, because Maddie said to me, it's really quite simple in all my questions to Maddie. Am I saying this right? Am I doing this right? What's happening? And Maddie said, it's quite simple. You take a side. You literally take a side. And the side that I've taken is that I need to center people who are the most targeted in violence, with exclusion, with all of those things. I need to center them in the way in which I then operate. And so to me, that simple thing, take a side, has made so much sense to me. And so in taking a side, it means that that's the track that I now have to go, because that's the side I'm on. And so then, of course, you know, Sandy, who I often say, and I just wrote in some acknowledgements to a book that I've done, absolutely knows everything. And I wonder how somebody does that. No matter what you need to know, Sandy will have kind of this log in their head about where to find that information. So what a resource. So in our department then, we have at least 50% of us are queer folk. And so one of the things that worries me about inclusion is quotas. People say we need to include people, so we have a quota, and I can't tolerate that either, because that's not the side I'm on. So there is no quota. Everything that we try and do then is we ask ourselves those very questions that all of the people have said today is, you know, can the people see themselves in this seminar we're doing? Can everyone see themselves? Do we have representation from queer folk, from disabled folk, for women, for who, you know, are we inclusive of everything? Are we really on that side? And honoring what that means. So we ask ourselves that every time. So every symposium and seminar we have spaces, and we ensure that it's not the one panel at the end. It's actually central to the activities that we do. And this is all learning that I've been able to do because I made that decision to be on that side. And it doesn't mean that I always get it right, and I don't. And I really started thinking about pronouns, and that's something I hadn't had to think of, and what a privilege that is. My pronouns are she and her, and I've never had to actually think, what does it mean to misgender somebody, until the learning from my fabulous colleagues and my own child. So now I've gone back and looked at the things that I've written and the way in which I've identified people as she or he, and think, I don't know that person, I don't know their voice. And so now in my writing, I ensure that I don't do that. And I just try every day to be better and to be on that side. So I'm giving great thanks and praise to Percy, to Andy, to Maddie, to Sandy, and all those people who continue to teach me, as well as everyone else on this panel. So that's all from me.
Wow, thank you so much. That's an amazing framing of it. I'm going to now throw to Lynn, who's been hosting this, to talk a little bit about this issue of inclusion and what it means to you, and then we're going to finish off with Tama talking to us about that too. No, we're not going to get to questions. But I'd really like to say, if you come in next week to our final one in this series, we'll answer some of the questions that have been posed over the last few weeks that we haven't quite gotten to. So come on back. Great. Thank you, Lynn.
Great. Chimigwech Sandy. Trickster is in my house. I keep losing my power. So now I'm trying to stay still on my phone while I hold it. Oh, so it disconnected, I think, 3 or 4 times. So something's going on. I'm going to have to go check the power. I want to say Chimigwech, especially to Percy, Maddie, Sandy, and Andy. And I need to say her name, Alora, Wells, Hennessy, and Wheeler. So Alora was a young woman who is the daughter of a friend that I grew up with in Regent Park. And Mary passed away. I think she wasn't even 50 yet, from cancer. And unfortunately, a lot of the people that I grew up, as well as my family, pass away very early. And Alora was Mary's daughter, and Alora was found dead and in a park, and her body wasn't identified for 3 months. So the police did not notify anybody. They contacted an agency in Toronto, 519, didn't find who was missing. So eventually they found out who Alora was. And, I think the media has done a real disservice to speaking about who Alora is, who Alora was, and who her family was. And we've lost sight of that. That was in 2017. So I just wanted to say her name. With respect to identity, really picking up on my introduction, as well as then what Carrie identified. And, one of the reasons why I started to identify who I am, who my people are, and where they come from. Number one, I'm Métis, right? I'm white passing, right? I have a position in the academy because I checked the box. And I think that, in order for us to work well together, right, we need to speak about who we are. It's something we do, right? I go across Canada and I say who my people are, like, hey, you're my cousin, right? That's something that we do anyway, right? It's not just for the academy, but I feel a responsibility when I'm taking this position, because our identities are so complex, right, across globally, but particularly in Canada with respect to the Indian Act, that really dictates who is and who is not status Indian, right? And someone, isn't that stereotypical view or the phenotypical view of what an Indigenous person looks like. So I feel I have a responsibility. I hope that doesn't make other people uncomfortable in how I identify, but I do that because it's part of education, right? I'm not status First Nation. I didn't grow up on reserve, right? So I just wanted to say that, and I think we have to do that more and more in order to educate people about who Indigenous people are. We're phenomenal people with all of our intersectionalities, right? With all of our multiplicities of identity. So I just wanted to say that, and I want to go back to Alora and just speak about, sorry, something came through my phone because now I'm using my phone. Just speak quickly about, you know, the multiplicity of Alora's identity. She was Black. She was trans, right? And, you know, nobody cared to help identify who the family was, right? That intersectionality of Alora's identity is important with respect to how her body was treated, right? So I'll end there and say Chimigwech to everybody, and hopefully my phone doesn't die.
Thank you so much. That's, yeah, it's really powerful, and thanks for speaking your name. Taima, if we can get you to answer this question, this difficult question.
Thanks everybody for sharing. I always feel I take away from everybody's conversation something that always adds something to me, because most of our life has been about being excluded. And having this group and having our friends on Twitter helps me feel more included. And I might look brave and I might have a full professorship, but there are days where I feel more excluded than included. So this mentorship that we have, the support that we give each other, and the depth and breadth in which you share your stories really resonates, and it helps me heal. So I just want to say thank you, everybody, and a real special thank you to Andy for joining. I hope you stay on. So 2 words: visibility and claiming space. So I put myself into spaces where we're not normally invited. And at our university, I find myself into those in those spaces a lot. And my colleagues now know me as that kind of person. And I try to bring to those spaces a way to understand indigenizing, a way to understand their role and their part in decolonizing, because I don't think that Indigenous people need to be decolonizing on our own. It takes all of us to lift racism. It is all of our responsibility, not just Indigenous people. And so I use those spaces for education. I use those spaces to teach. And so I also am a why person. Like, why is that? How come we don't have that on our policy? When did that happen? What year was that done? Well, I'm going to find out. And I'm going to find out soon. And then I'm going to come back. And then I'm going to ask you again. Okay, you don't have it. Oh, well, it doesn't exist. Well, I'll write it then, is the kind of character that I bring to my academy. I wasn't always like that. I was always quite shy and introvert. And now I find myself in my last few years of being a professor before I retire, that I must do something more than I've ever done before. And that's to leave our indigeneity in that space in order for it to grow and become more bigger and brighter and amazing than it is. So again, to my colleagues and the wonderful Professor Sandy O'Sullivan for moderating our session, and to my beautiful colleagues, just thank you so much for what you share and what you give to me. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We might just finish up on that note, just reminding people that this will be up on YouTube. We'll send around the link on the Twitter page, which is the III one, so International Indigenous Intellectuals, up on Twitter. And please share, please come along next week when we'll answer some of these questions and also pose some other questions for the people who are included here. Thank you. One of the things I just want to finish with is, you know, Percy has just had a reminder, has just posted up a reminder to say, if you're trans, gender diverse, queer, indigiqueer, disabled, please take some time. Sometimes hearing from your own can be overwhelming, so please take care of yourselves. All of you can take care of yourselves. Thank you so much.
Before we go, hopefully, Lynn, are you still there?
Yep, I'm still here.
Okay, I know we know 1, 2, 3. So as you feel comfortable, those folks, if we can, sing to our colleague and moderator. 1, 2, the happy birthday song. 1, 2, 3. And
Happy birthday to you.
Happy
Happy
birthday
birthday
to
to you.
you.
Happy birthday.
Birthday, dear Sandy.
Wife,
Happy
husband,
birthday.
gluten. So 3 languages I sang to you, Sandy. The most
I
amazing
love
day.
this.
Okay.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
For the
Great.
for
See
the
you next
panelists,
week.
for panelists who want to debrief, I'll put the meeting ID and we can do that. Okay.
Okay, great.
Perfect.
Miigwech, everybody. Happy birthday.